There's a sound the executioners of Paris have never heard before. It isn't a scream. It isn't a plea for mercy. It isn't even the terrified silence of someone who knows the end has come. It's singing, a religious hymn in Latin, rising from 16 female voices walking toward the guillotine as calmly as if they were approaching an altar. And every time the blade falls, the singing continues with one fewer voice. Yet it never stops. The crowd, for once, has no idea how to react. For months they have cheered every execution, hurled insults, and demanded more blood. Today they stand mute. What they are witnessing defies everything they understand. These are the Carmelites of Compiègne, 16 cloistered nuns who had not left their convent in decades. Today the revolution will kill them for it. One of them is Sister Constance, 29 years old, the youngest of the group. She has spent 9 years inside those walls. The first sight she ever has of the outside world is the guillotine itself. She is the first to climb the scaffold. Before she takes a single step toward the blade, she kneels before the older woman at the head of the line, their prioress, and asks softly, "Permission to die, mother?" The prioress caresses her face. "Go, my child." Constance kisses the small statue of the Virgin hidden in the prioress's palm, gently pushes the executioner's hand aside, and walks forward singing. She is the first. She will not be the last. What happens over the next hour will leave Paris in stunned silence. A city addicted to death, suddenly speechless before 16 women who refuse to stop singing. This is not legend. It happened on July 17, 1794, at the bloodiest peak of the French Revolution. And just 10 days later, Maximilien Robespierre, the man who signed their death warrant and built the guillotine's empire, would climb those same steps and die beneath its blade. But what no one ever tells you is what came before that scaffold. How 16 women who had never seen violence were dragged from their convent, stripped of everything they believed in, and ordered to renounce their faith or die. They chose death, but not before making a vow that would haunt the revolution for centuries. This is crown and dagger, and this is what really happened. By 1794, France had lost its mind. What began as a revolution for liberty had become a machine of death. The promises of freedom and equality had drowned in blood. Maximilien Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety saw enemies everywhere. Aristocrats in attics, priests saying secret masses, anyone who failed to cheer loudly enough at the executions. The solution was brutally simple: kill them all. In less than a year, the Revolutionary Tribunal sent more than 17,000 people to the guillotine. In Paris alone, executions sometimes reached 30 in a single afternoon. The executioners worked with mechanical precision: load, position, drop, next. They could kill a person every 2 minutes. The square where the Carmelites would die, the Place du Trône Renversé, had claimed 1,306 victims in just 6 weeks. The ground was so soaked with blood that pools collected between the cobblestones. Neighbors filed official complaints about the stench. Death had become a public nuisance. Robespierre reserved a special hatred for the Catholic Church. He saw it as the monarchy's last loyal ally, a force that kept people stupid and obedient. Churches were shuttered or turned into temples of reason. Priests were forced to renounce their vows or face the blade. Religious holidays vanished. Even the calendar was rewritten to erase every trace of Christianity. Wearing a religious habit became a crime punishable by death. For the 16 Carmelites living quietly in their convent in Compiègne, 50 miles from Paris, this was a death sentence waiting to be signed. In September 1792, soldiers expelled them from their home. They were forbidden to wear their habits, forbidden to live together. Yet their prioress, Mother Teresa of St. Augustine, refused to let the community scatter. She found for small apartments in town where they could hide and continue their prayers in whispers. Then she did something extraordinary. She gathered her sisters and proposed a solemn vow. They would offer their lives as a sacrifice for France, not to seek death, but to accept it willingly if it came, to offer their suffering so the bloodshed might finally end. 2 of the older nuns hesitated. The idea sounded like madness. Mother Teresa gave them time to pray. Within hours they returned, asking forgiveness for their fear. The community voted unanimously. From that day on, every morning at 4 o'clock, the 16 Carmelites renewed their offering. They prayed that if their deaths could purchase peace for France, God would accept the sacrifice. They did not know when death would come. They only knew they were ready. For 2 years they waited, praying, hiding, watching the terror devour everyone around them. Then, in June 1794, someone talked. On June 21st, soldiers burst through their doors before dawn. A neighbor had claimed the government's bounty for exposing hidden religious. 2 years of careful secrecy vanished with one whisper. The soldiers found letters, prayer books, religious medals, and a small statue of the Virgin, enough evidence to condemn them for fanaticism and counter-revolutionary activity. In plain language, their crime was praying. The sisters were taken to a former convent turned prison. The irony was cruel. Nuns now locked inside a building that once protected women just like them. Yet something strange happened behind those walls. Other prisoners noticed them. In a place of despair and madness, these 16 women rose at 4 each morning, sang hymns in their cells, and comforted the terrified. English Benedictine nuns imprisoned alongside them later wrote that the Carmelites seemed to be preparing for a wedding, not an execution. On July 12th, guards came to transport them to Paris for trial. Their civilian clothes were still being washed, so they traveled in their forbidden religious habits. For hours they rode in open carts through jeering crowds, singing hymns the entire way. Their voices carried over the mob. By the time they reached Paris, they had already become something the revolution could not handle. The trial was a farce. The Revolutionary Tribunal offered no presumption of innocence, no real defense, no appeal. The verdict was decided before the first word was spoken. Prosecutor Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville had sent hundreds to death without losing a night's sleep. He had tried Marie Antoinette, scientists, poets, generals, all with the same bored indifference. To him, these women were simply the next 16 names on his list. He read the charges in a monotone. Fanaticism, hiding weapons, supporting the monarchy. The only weapons found were rosaries, pictures of saints, and a small statue of the Virgin Mary. When Mother Teresa heard the word fanaticism, she interrupted, calmly, almost curiously. "Please explain what you mean by that word." Fouquier-Tinville stared at her as if an insect had spoken. "Your attachment to childish beliefs and foolish religious practices." A murmur swept the courtroom. Everyone expected her to beg or apologize. Instead, she smiled, a peaceful, knowing smile. "If believing in God is fanaticism," she said, "then yes, we are all guilty, and we will die gladly." The tribunal asked each nun the same question. "Will you renounce your vows, deny your faith, and swear allegiance to the Republic?" One word could save them. One denial and they could walk free. Constance, the youngest, answered first. "No." Sister Marie of the Incarnation, 30 years a Carmelite. "No." Sister Euphrasia, who had once hesitated at the vow of sacrifice. "No." 16 times the answer was the same. The verdict, death for all. When the sentence was read, the Carmelites did not weep. They renewed their religious vows right there in the courtroom, in front of the men who had just condemned them. Then they began to sing the Te Deum, a hymn of thanksgiving. They were thanking God for the privilege of dying for their faith. The guards stood frozen. Even Fouquier-Tinville looked confused. Prisoners did not sing after receiving death sentences. But no one stopped them. July 17, 1794, late afternoon. The summer heat pressed down on Paris. The stench at the Place du Trône Renversé was unbearable. The 16 Carmelites were loaded into carts with 24 other prisoners. From the first moment they were different. While others wept or sat numb, the nuns sang for 3 straight hours through the streets of Paris. Miserere, Salve Regina, Te Deum, ancient hymns the city had not heard in years. People stopped to stare. Shopkeepers stepped outside. Women leaned from windows. Children asked why the ladies were singing. Paris had seen thousands carted to death. It had never seen anyone who looked peaceful, almost joyful. When the carts reached the square, Executioner Charles-Henri Sanson was waiting. He had killed thousands. He had seen every human reaction to death. He had never seen what awaited him now. The nuns asked permission to sing one final hymn. Sanson agreed. They sang the Veni Creator Spiritus, Come, Holy Spirit. Then they renewed their vows one last time. Mother Teresa announced the order, youngest to oldest. The older nuns would watch the younger ones go first, lending them strength until the end. Constance stepped forward. She knelt before her prioress. Permission to die, Mother? Go, my daughter. She kissed the tiny statue, climbed the scaffold alone, looked at her sisters one final time, and kept singing until the blade fell. The crowd was silent. Sister St. Louis knelt. Permission to die, Mother? Kiss, climb, sing, blade. One by one the ritual repeated. Each nun pushed aside the executioner's hand. Each sang until her voice was silenced. The crowd remained motionless. These were people who had turned executions into entertainment. Now they stood in complete silence while 16 women turned a killing ground into an act of worship. Sister Julie of Jesus, a lay sister who had spent her life doing manual labor, climbed with the same dignity as the choir nuns. She had never learned Latin, yet she sang the hymns from memory the way she had sung them every day for decades. Sister Mary of Jesus Crucified was 78, the eldest. She had been a Carmelite for more than 50 years. She looked at the executioner and said quietly, I forgive you with all my heart, and I pray God forgives you too. Then she climbed without help, still singing. 5 voices, 3, 2. And finally only one. Mother Teresa of St. Augustine stood alone. She had blessed 15 daughters, watched 15 of them die, held the statue they kissed. Now there was no one left to bless her. She sang the final verse of the Salve Regina alone, her voice carrying across the blood-soaked square. Then she climbed the scaffold, positioned herself beneath the blade, looked up at the sky, and the song ended. The blade fell, and Paris went silent, the most profound silence the city had ever known. In a place that had normalized death as public entertainment, 16 singing nuns had done the impossible. They had made Paris ashamed. Their bodies were thrown into a mass grave at Picpus Cemetery along with hundreds of other victims. No markers, no ceremony, just another pile of corpses in a city that had too many to count. But something had broken that afternoon, something the revolution could not repair. People could not stop talking about the 16 nuns who had walked to death singing, their faces radiant with peace. For months Parisians had told themselves the executions were necessary. But these women had done nothing except pray. The question hung in the air like smoke that would not clear. 10 days later, on July 27th, Robespierre was arrested. The next day, July 28th, he was dragged to the same scaffold. He did not sing. Witnesses say he screamed so loudly it echoed across the square. The reign of terror was over. Coincidence? The revolutionaries who survived called it politics and timing. The people who had stood in that square that afternoon were not so sure. Something had shifted on July 17th. The terror had fed on fear. 16 women had shown that fear could be defeated, that the guillotine could take the body but never the soul. The English Benedictines who had shared their prison survived. When released, they kept the Carmelites' civilian clothes as relics. They spent the rest of their lives telling anyone who would listen what they had witnessed. The Catholic Church took longer. For over a century Rome said nothing official. Some historians believe the Church was ashamed it could not protect them. Others say the story was too politically dangerous. It was not until 1906 that Pope Pius X beatified them. And only in December 2024 did Pope Francis officially declare them saints. 230 years. That is how long it took for the Church to recognize what the crowd in Paris understood in a single afternoon. There is a cemetery in Paris where the Carmelites are buried, Picpus. It is hidden behind walls, away from tourist maps. Most Parisians have never heard of it. Inside it is quiet. Trees, grass, a small chapel with names inscribed on the wall. More than 300 victims of the terror lie there, most forgotten. But 16 of those names still echo. Constance, Marie, Julie, Teresa, women who chose death over betrayal, who answered terror with music, who showed a city drunk on blood what courage truly looks like. Every July 17th, a small group gathers at Picpus. They light candles, they pray, and they sing the same hymns that Constance and her sisters sang 230 years ago. The Salve Regina, the Veni Creator. Voices in a quiet cemetery keeping alive the memory of voices that once silenced a screaming mob. 16 women who believed their sacrifice could stop a massacre. Were they right? Did their deaths help end the terror? History cannot prove it. But we know this: 10 days after they died, the architect of the terror died on the same scaffold. And 230 years later, people still remember the names of 16 singing nuns, while the names of their executioners have faded into nothing. Maybe that is the only answer that matters. Maybe the real victory is not surviving. It is being remembered for what you refuse to surrender. This is Crown and Dagger. We don't sanitize history. We show you what actually happened. If you want more stories the world tried to bury, hit subscribe.